Nico Hulkenberg has been on and off in Formula 1 for the last 13 years. In that time he has started almost 200 Grand Prix, scored one pole position and has proved a solid pair of hands for whichever team he is driven for. But he also has the unwanted record of having the most Grand Prix starts without a podium finish. This is always something that has managed to elude him, despite the fact that he has always proved highly popular and highly rated amongst his drivers and peers. This has always led to a fascinating debate around Hulkenberg's career. Is he underrated or is he overrated? It seems there is a clear divide amongst Formula 1 fans. Whenever I'm on social media, there seems to be a clear disparity between fans. They either go one way or the other. They never sit on the fence. Hulkenberg is clearly a very talented driver. He always has been. But his stats have always failed to back this up, despite the fact he came into Formula 1 as a hot prospect after an amazing junior career. Just looking at Hulkenberg's Formula 1 career, it is easy to see why there is a clear divide amongst fans as to whether Hulkenberg is actually as good as we think he is, or if he actually is a bit of a flop. He's been through his fair share of highs and lows during his time in Formula 1, and this can be traced right back to his rookie season when he was driving for Williams in 2010 alongside Rubens Barrichello. Barrichello largely outperformed Hulkenberg during that year, but it was Hulkenberg that would get Williams' highlight of the season when he put his car on pole position in mixed conditions during qualifying for the Brazilian Grand Prix. This was the first real indication that we had of just how good Hulkenberg was in these kind of conditions. He had an amazing feel for the car, he knew where the grip was, but despite this result it didn't stop him from losing his seat at Williams for the following year. But after a year out, Hulkenberg was back on the grid, this time with Force India in 2012, and after a season in which he'd scored a handful of points finishes and proved a consistent performer, he was once again showcasing his brilliance in mixed conditions at the season finale in Brazil. When you look back at this Grand Prix, it does feel like it's the race that got away from Hulkenberg. It was a wasted opportunity because he led a Grand Prix in a Force India, which was a car that did not deserve to be racing at the front of the grid. But yet there he was fighting the likes of Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button for the lead of the race. He led that race for over 40 laps, which was pretty impressive. And unfortunately for him, the chances of victory would slip away when he made a mistake when trying to retake the lead from Hamilton, when he slid into the McLaren at turn 1, ending Hamilton's race and ultimately costing Hulkenberg the chance of fighting for the victory, as he was handed a drive-through penalty for the incident. That Brazil race would begin what would become sort of a running theme in Hulkenberg's career, where whenever he'd been in contention for a podium, there would always be some sort of issue. It always seemed like the racing gods would do whatever they could to stop Hulkenberg from getting on the podium, whether that be an issue with the car or whether Hulkenberg would actually make a mistake himself. Monaco 2016, Brazil 2016, Singapore 2017, they're just another couple of examples of races where Hulkenberg was in contention for a podium and then certain variables would come into play, mostly out of his control, that would prevent him from standing on the rostrum. But there has been times, like Brazil 2012, when Hulkenberg has had an outside shot of scoring a podium finish and has thrown it away through a critical mistake at a certain point in the race, such as the German Grand Prix in 2019 when he was driving for Renault. This would prove to be one of the most memorable Grand Prix of recent times, as the wet conditions were catching out pretty much everyone, including the top drivers. But Hulkenberg was once again mastering the conditions really well and had managed to work his way through the order and was running inside the top 4. His pace was not only really strong throughout the wet conditions, that it was really consistent. In fact, he was catching the leaders at this point in the race. But then he made a crucial error at the penultimate corner as he ran wide onto the drag strip, which was pretty much an ice rink during this race. It had already caught out several drivers during the Grand Prix as they'd aquaplaned straight off either into the barrier or into the gravel trap. And sadly for Hulkenberg, he would become the latest victim as he speared straight off into the barrier and beached his car in the gravel. He blew what was a real shot to get his first top 3 finish, and this one hurt even more because of course it happened at his home Grand Prix. But whether or not Hulkenberg has thrown away a podium through a mistake by himself or certain elements have come into play, you cannot deny that Hulkenberg is worthy of a place on the grid, and it is clear to see why Haas decided to take him over Mick Schumacher for 2023. His experience is invaluable to the team. Haas has always been somebody that has always favoured experience over youth, and Hulkenberg is just the kind of driver that they need because he always brings the car home and doesn't make too many mistakes over a season. In fact, if you look at Hulkenberg's career, he never seems to make more than 2 or 3 mistakes over a season. I will admit that when Haas was going through the process of choosing whether it wanted to stick with Schumacher or take on Hulkenberg instead, I was more in favour of them sticking with Schumacher because I felt he had done just enough to earn another year in that seat. But you can clearly see why it went with Hulkenberg, and ultimately it was the right decision. I can see why people were a little bit sketchy when Hulkenberg was announced as Haas's driver for this season, because he hadn't driven in F1 full time since 2019 when he was dumped by Renault. But I'd always felt that this was an unfair decision, because I think that when he was at Renault, even in that final season against Daniel Ricciardo, I thought he performed solidly, even if Ricciardo did have the upper hand in the head-to-head battle. I think that we can all agree that even if Hulkenberg hadn't done enough to keep a seat at Renault for 2020, he had certainly done more than enough to warrant a place on the grid somewhere else. So the fact that a driver of his calibre spent the next 3 years trying to return to Formula One without any success, and the fact that other drivers who were clearly less talented than him but just had more financial backing taking up a seat that he should have been in, was a bit of a joke. Hulkenberg has always been a very dependable driver. More often than not, he's always able to get the most out of the car, even if you have to say there are some areas in his racing where he is certainly not as strong as other drivers on the grid, which means he's not quite as rounded as his rivals. But I think that the fact that he has got this unwanted record of the most starts without a podium finish somewhat overshadows just how good a driver he is and how much of a prospect he was when he came up through the junior ranks. Hulkenberg won in every junior competition that he competed in, and he even won back-to-back championships in Euro F3 in 2008 and then in GP2 in 2009, which he won at his first attempt in his rookie season. I think given how highly rated Hulkenberg was as he rose up the junior categories, at one point he was even tipped to be the next Michael Schumacher, I don't think we should belittle him for the fact that he hasn't met these clearly high expectations. He just seems to me to be one of these drivers who has always been solid. He's just failed to fulfill his potential in Formula One. And Hulkenberg hasn't just proved a reliable driver over the years, he's also proved pretty handy when it comes to being called up at the last minute as a super sub. Look at his performances through the COVID pandemic when he was asked to step in for the likes of Sergio Perez and Lance Stroll and Sebastian Vettel at Racing Point and Aston Martin. Even when he's had limited time in the car, he's always managed to deliver a result. And when it comes to this season, even though it's his teammate Kevin Magnussen who knows the team inside out, he's in his 6th season at Haas, it is Hulkenberg that is outperforming Magnussen in the head-to-head battle. He currently sits ahead of Magnussen in the Drivers' Championship after his 7th place finish in Melbourne, and he also has outqualified Magnussen at the majority of the races and has 4 Q3 appearances to his name, including last time out in Canada when he qualified on the front row in mixed conditions, as you probably guessed, even if sadly he would lose this front row for a red flag infringement. Qualifying is something that has been a real noticeable improvement in Hulkenberg's driving this season, because one lap pace is something that hasn't always been one of Hulkenberg's greatest strengths. It could be down to the fact that the Haas car is more suited to qualifying than the race, where there's a real performance drop-off. The Haas seems to be very hard on its tyres and struggles with tyre degradation, but nevertheless Hulkenberg has always seemed to get the most out of the Haas during qualifying this year. Looking back, I think it's really unfortunate that Hulkenberg was never given the opportunity to race for a top team. He always seemed to be overlooked and spent most of his career racing in midfield machinery. The closest he came to racing for one of the top teams was when Ferrari almost signed him for 2014, but he decided to go with Kimi Raikkonen instead. It's a shame that a chance has never come his way, because it would have been interesting to see how Nico would have got on in a front-running car. And if you look at the current situation at Aston Martin, for example, where there's a clear disparity between Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll in terms of performance, you've got to say that if Hulkenberg was in that car alongside Alonso, the gap would not be as large. He would be pushing Fernando a lot harder than Stroll is. So maybe he is still deserving of a chance with one of the top teams on the grid and would prove a more reliable pair of hands. You have to wonder that if Hulkenberg didn't have the fact that he's never scored a podium finish in his career hanging over him, whether opinion of him would have changed. Personally, I don't think it would have. I think it's very similar to Sir Stirling Moss. Would Moss be as revered as he is now if he had won a world championship? I don't think he would have. So I think that Hulkenberg, on the whole, deserves more credit than he is given. He clearly is a great driver that has just failed to gain the results that everybody was expecting of him from his stellar junior career. But nevertheless, he's at the end of his career and has proved that he still has a lot to give to Formula One. So where do you guys sit on this? Do you think that Hulkenberg is underrated, or do you think that he's overrated? And what are the reasons behind your choice? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.